On October 20th, 1951, a black college football player had his jaw deliberately broken by a white opponent. Not once, but 3 times in 7 minutes. No penalty, no ejection, no consequences. The university did nothing. The photos ran in Life magazine and won a Pulitzer Prize. And it still took 54 years just to get an apology. In the fall of 1951, 2 newspaper photographers flew from Des Moines to Stillwater, Oklahoma, to cover a college football game. They had 15 minutes on the ground before they had to turn around and make their deadline. 15 minutes, but that's all it took. Because in that window, they captured something that had been happening to black athletes for decades, in plain sight. Something everyone knew was there, something no one had ever been forced to confront. Until now. This is the story of Johnny Bright. But more than that, this is the story of what happened next when those photographs left no room for denial, and the people in power chose to look away anyway. Before October 20th, 1951, there's something you need to understand about Johnny Bright. Not what happened to him, but who he was. Because by nearly any measure you want to apply, he wasn't just good. He was the most dominant offensive player in college football at the time. He played at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, a small school with 5,000 students, not exactly a football factory, and he made that completely irrelevant. In his sophomore year, his first season of varsity eligibility, he came off the bench in his first game and promptly scored 2 touchdowns, threw for a third, and finished with 250 yards of offense. The coaching staff had seen enough, and from that moment on, the entire Drake offense was rebuilt around him. They called it the BRP, Bright Run or Pass, because at any given moment on any given play, he could beat you either way. He became the first player in college football history to run and pass for over 1,000 yards in a single season, and he led the NCAA in total offense 2 years in a row, while accounting for roughly 70% of Drake's points and 70% of their yardage. He was a 215-pound fullback who could outrun defensive backs in the open field and run through linebackers between the tackles, and who also had the vision and arm strength to drop a 60-yard touchdown pass the moment a defense overcommitted to stopping the run. Today, we would call that a dual-threat quarterback. But in 1951, there wasn't even a name for what he was doing, because no one had ever seen it before. By his senior year, sports writers across the country had made him the frontrunner for the Heisman Trophy, which would have made him the first black player ever to win it. The night before Drake's season opener, the city of Des Moines held Johnny Bright Night, where the mayor and the governor joined 2,000 people packed into a basketball arena to give a standing ovation to a 21-year-old from Fort Wayne, Indiana, who had come to their small school and become the best player in the country. That was the night before the game and the incident. What happened to Johnny Bright did not happen in a vacuum. It didn't come out of nowhere. And to understand it, you have to understand what the football field had long been for black athletes in America. In the 1890s, George Jewett, the first black player in the Big Ten, played to chants of "Kill the Coon," echoing from the opposing stands. In the 1930s, Iowa running back Ozzie Simmons faced not only defenders, but his own teammates, men who allegedly refused to block for him, leaving him to absorb punishing hit after punishing hit. One newspaper described him as the lad who ran alone. And in 1923, Iowa State's Jack Trice, the first black athlete in that school's history, traveled to Minnesota for just the second game of his college career. The night before, separated from his teammates at the team hotel, he wrote a letter. "The honor of my race, family, and self are at stake." The next day, members of the opposing backfield stomped him while he lay on the ground. He died 2 days later from his injuries. He was 21 years old. This was the world Johnny Bright was playing in. Not some distant past, not ancient history. Trice was killed just 28 years before Bright took the field in Stillwater. Part of the same pattern, the same permission structure, the same willingness by officials and institutions to see exactly what was happening and look away anyway. By the fall of 1951, Oklahoma A&M had technically integrated, forced to do so by court order just 2 years earlier. But in Stillwater, both in the community and within the football program, there were many who had no intention of accepting what integration actually meant. A line had been crossed, whether they liked it or not, and for some of them, there was only one way left to respond: send a message. The warnings started before Drake's players ever boarded the bus. Word spread that Oklahoma A&M intended to go after Bright, not just contain him, not just play him hard, but target him specifically. The message, repeated in the days leading up to the game, was as clear as it was chilling. John Bright will not finish the game. The Des Moines Register sent 2 photographers to cover the game. Donald Tang and John Robinson flew down that morning with a simple assignment: get the game, make the deadline, get home. They had 15 minutes before they had to turn around. They positioned themselves near the Drake sideline and waited. On the very first offensive play of the game, Johnny Bright took the snap. It was a standard running play. He handed off to his fullback, Gene McCumber, and rolled away from the action, standing upright, watching the play develop. What happened next, the officials didn't see, or said they didn't see. Some in the crowd didn't see either. Supposedly, almost no one in the stadium saw it, but Ultong and Robinson saw it. Oklahoma A&M D tackle Will Banks Smith cut in front of his own teammate, moving away from the ball and toward Bright. Bright was standing still, unaware, when Smith drove his fist into his jaw with enough force to lift him off his feet. Bright was unconscious before he hit the ground. His jaw wasn't just bruised. It wasn't just cracked. It was entirely shattered. The trainers came out. Bright regained consciousness. And then he did something that tells you more about who he was than any statistic ever could. He told his coaches he was staying in the game. He said, quote, "I'm going to stay in that game, and they're not going to defeat me because that's what they want, to take me out." On the very next series, Bright threw a 61-yard touchdown pass with a shattered jaw, having just been knocked unconscious, and Wilbanks Smith hit him again. Then, on the third play, Bright was dragged down by multiple A&M defenders and punched while he lay on the ground. 3 hits, 7 minutes of game time, and by then there was no missing it. The officials stood on that field and not only let it happen, they watched it happen. They chose not to act, never throwing a flag, not once. Ultang and Robinson captured the second hit on film, frame by frame, sequence by sequence, the fist, the impact, the collapse, undeniable. They made their deadline, and within days the photographs ran across the country. After the game, Bright sat in the Stillwater train depot, his jaw already wired shut, in tremendous pain. A depot employee approached him and told him that black passengers were not allowed to sit in that section. Bright looked up at the man and said, "If you're man enough to move me, go ahead and try." The man turned and walked away. Johnny Bright did not play another college football game that season. He lost the Heisman. He never got another chance. What followed was not the absence of accountability. It was the deliberate construction of it. Drake University filed a formal complaint with the Missouri Valley Conference, demanding that Oklahoma A&M be disciplined for what had been intentionally done to Johnny Bright. The evidence was undeniable. Photographs already published across the country, already printed in Life magazine, already seen by millions of people who had no trouble understanding exactly what they showed. The conference reviewed that evidence and issued its ruling. No penalty, no suspension, no reprimand. Oklahoma, A and M and Wilbanks Smith would face no consequences whatsoever. The official position was simple. The incident did not warrant disciplinary action. Drake withdrew from the conference in protest. Bradley University did the same, and its decision carried its own indictment. Earlier that year, the Missouri Valley Conference had stripped Bradley's basketball program of a championship over point-shaving violations. So, the same conference that could punish a school for gambling now claimed it had no authority to act on a racially motivated assault captured on film. Bradley's athletic director called it what it was, a complete contradiction. The conference would police the integrity of a box score, but not the safety of a black player's body. It was one of the most significant acts of institutional courage in college sports history, and almost nobody remembers it happened. Meanwhile, the NCAA, the so-called governing body of college football, did respond to the Johnny Bright incident, just not in the way you might expect. In the immediate aftermath, momentum built to mandate protective face masks, and the Bright incident was explicitly cited as the catalyst. The logic was straightforward. Players needed protection from accidental or deliberate blows to the head. Let that sit for a moment. The NCAA looked at what happened to Johnny Bright, a targeted, premeditated assault, captured on film, awarded a Pulitzer Prize, and responded by changing the equipment. They said they made the game safer. But the player who broke his jaw? Nothing. The program that enabled it? Nothing. The conference that cleared it? Nothing. They protected the future while burying the past, and they called it reform. In the spring of 1952, the Philadelphia Eagles selected Johnny Bright with the 5th overall pick in the NFL draft, ahead of players like Frank Gifford, who would go on to a Hall of Fame career. The Eagles had never signed a black player, and Bright would have been the first, but he declined. He said the roster was filled with Southern players who had made it clear they didn't want him there, and he had already spent enough of his life being somewhere he wasn't wanted. Instead, he went north and signed with the Calgary Stampeders, where he spent 13 seasons becoming one of the greatest players in Canadian football history. The sport that used his broken jaw as justification to make itself safer had offered him nothing in return. No protection, no justice, no acknowledgement. So he left, built a different life, and the American football establishment moved on as if none of it had ever happened. Wilbanks Smith was never suspended, never fined, never publicly held accountable by any governing body in the sport. He lived until 2000, and in the decades that followed, he described what happened that day as simply football. For 54 years, Oklahoma A&M, renamed Oklahoma State in 1957, never issued a formal apology. Not when the photographs won the Pulitzer Prize, not when Bright built a Hall of Fame career in Canada, not when he was inducted into the Missouri Valley Conference Hall of Fame, not even when he died in 1983. Not once in 54 years did anyone in a position of authority look at what had been done in their name and say the two words the Bright family had been owed since 1951. In 2005, a Drake University alumnus named Mitch Levy noticed something interesting on a basketball schedule. Drake and Oklahoma State were both entered in the same Las Vegas tournament, and if both teams advanced, they would meet on the court. Levy called Drake's president, David Maxwell, and told him there was unfinished business. Maxwell agreed. What followed was a phone call between two university presidents, one from Drake, one from Oklahoma State, and the conversation, by all accounts, was straightforward. Oklahoma State's president, David Schmidley, said it wasn't a difficult decision. He said it was important. He said the right thing to do was clear. So in the fall of 2005, 54 years after the assault, representatives from Oklahoma State University met with the family of Johnny Bright and issued a formal apology. They finally acknowledged what had happened. They finally acknowledged what had not been done. They finally acknowledged the deafening silence. 54 years. Johnny Bright had been dead for 22 of them. His mother, who raised 5 sons in Fort Wayne and taught the second oldest that he could be anything, never heard those words. The teammates who rode buses in protest and refused to eat in restaurants that wouldn't serve their quarterback. Most of them never heard them either. The coaches at Drake who filed the complaint, who fought the conference, who watched it all get buried and walked away with nothing, they didn't hear it. The apology was real. The man who gave it meant it. But it came half a century too late for the people who needed it most. Johnny Bright retired from football in 1964 after 13 seasons in the CFL. He won 3 Grey Cups, became the first black player to win the league's Most Outstanding Player award, and set rushing records that stood for years. Along the way, he earned a master's degree in education from Indiana University. He became a teacher, then a coach, then a principal. A school principal who, by every account from every student who passed through his halls, had the rare ability to make young people feel like they mattered. On December 14, 1983, he checked into a hospital in Edmonton for a routine knee surgery, an old injury from his playing days. Unfortunately, he never came home. He was 53 years old. In the years that followed, his name endured. A K-9 school in Edmonton now bears it. Drake University established the John D. Bright College. In Canada, there are parks and murals. In Iowa, halls of fame. And in Stillwater, Oklahoma, there is an apology, issued in 2005. Sincere, real, but 22 years too late for the man it was meant for. Because this story was never just about one punch on one Saturday in October. It was about what happened next. The conference that cleared the aggressor. The governing body that changed the rules and ignored the crime. The franchise that drafted him and offered a locker room that didn't want him there. And every year that followed, every moment someone could have acted and didn't. The photographs existed. They had always existed. Published, circulated, awarded, preserved. The evidence was never in doubt. What was in doubt was whether the people in power believed it mattered. Johnny Bright believed it did. He spent 53 years proving it, not by waiting for the game to acknowledge what it owed him, but by building something it could never take back. A legacy carried in the students he taught, the players he coached, the lives he shaped. In the end, he became something bigger than the sport that failed him. He became what it refused to be. And he did it without their permission.